Good morning, everyone, and welcome to ISAP's 2024 Risk Management Conference, a three-part webinar series to future-proof your farm. This is week 2, where we will focus on unpredictable weather risks on the farm. We are recording these webinars for future viewing. Let's get started. So ISAP, or the Illinois Sustainable Ag Partnership, is a coalition of 15 member organizations, and their individual logos can be seen on the screen here. We are all working to improve soil health and water quality by promoting the adoption of conservation cropping systems. ISAP formed in 2017 in response to Illinois' nutrient loss reduction strategy, and we focus on providing technical, pragmatic resources to Illinois farmers and crop advisors on best practices to reduce nutrient losses and meet sustainability goals across Illinois' 26 million acres of ag land. For today's webinar, I am joined by ISAP colleagues, Frank Rademacher, who will meet in a bit, Rachel Lechuga running slides and tech troubleshooting, and Tori Colburn, who will moderate the Q&A session. So next, we're going to do a quick plug here for the our newsletter, The Aggregate. Besides our risk management conference, there are multiple ways you can stay plugged in with ISAP's resources. We want to share a few of them with you today. The Aggregate's the first published monthly, and we include upcoming events, learning opportunities, job openings, and technical resources. You can sign up on ISAP's website and see the info in the chat box. ISAP also hosts ICON, the Illinois Cover Crop On-Farm Network. This is a monthly call for crop advisors to share their perspectives from the field as they work with clients to implement cover crops across the state. Related to today's series, ICON is in the midst of a Happy Summer series on weeds, diseases, and pests. Feel free to sign up to be a part of that community of practice as well. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Frank.
Great. Thanks, Talon. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the 2024 Risk Management Conference that ISAP hosts. So we do host this every other year, and we try to highlight how conservation practices can serve to help mitigate production risk. So today, like Talon said, we're joined by Helen and Rachel from AFT. We're going to help run things behind the scenes. So if you need anything, shoot them or me a message, and we can get on top of it. And again, huge thanks to them for making this happen. We appreciate all the work that goes into this. So this year's theme is future-proof your farm, like we've said. And this session specifically is going to deal with changes in climate and weather events and some practical observations and mitigation strategies from the field. In addition to my role at the Nature Conservancy, I farm with my father in East Central Illinois, and we've seen firsthand that almost every year is marked by some record-breaking event, whether it be temperature highs and lows, rain events or lack thereof, or windstorms that move tons of soil. And it seems like every spring, my grandmother walks over and apologizes on behalf of the weather and says, you know, when we used to farm, I swear it wasn't like this. And so thankfully, we use a ton of conservation practices, and that's really helped us keep that water in the soil where it lands, and then keep the soil from moving and shading the soil so we don't lose water later in the season. But it still makes for some frustrating seasons. So today we're going to learn about the science behind those events and what to expect in the future, and then how to maybe get ahead of those changes from a practical field level. So today, again, we've decided to focus on climate science and field mitigation strategies, and we'll be hearing from Dr. Trent Ford and Dallas Glazik. So following these sessions, we'll have a roundtable Q&A session. So for your questions, please message those to us privately in the chat or put them in the public chat, and we'll get to those at the end. So now we'll hand it over to our first speaker, Dr. Trent Ford. And while I'm introducing him, we can go ahead and give him access. We can get his slides pulled up. So Dr. Trent Ford is the Illinois State Climatologist, has been with the Prairie Research Institute at the University of Illinois since 2019. He is an expert in climate and climate change and its interactions and impacts, especially as they relate to water. Trent leads climate and drought monitoring, research, and data collection for the state of Illinois. He and his team work with communities, industries, and state agencies on issues related to weather, climate, and climate change in Illinois, and engage the public through online, media, and educational outreach. As a native of Roanoke, Illinois, Ford earned a bachelor's in geography from Illinois State University before completing his master's and PhD at Texas A&M University. So Trent, as soon as you're ready, you're free to go.
All right. Thank you, Frank, and thanks for the opportunity here. So yeah, like Frank mentioned, we're going to talk about weather and climate risks on the farm, and this will be kind of a discussion of what we've witnessed over the last, few decades, and thinking about the future. And we really need to put on a perspective here of planning for the next 10 or 20 years, while also planning for every single year and the variability that comes with year to year kind of weather changes. So, well, I'll kind of hopefully put that in perspective. In the short amount of time that I'm talking here, there's no way I could cover the breadth of weather and climate, obviously. So if there are things that I don't hit on, that folks are interested in, that'd be a great, kickoff for questions afterward. Okay, so weather and climate risk is like drinking from the fire hose. And we think about things like Frank mentioned, not enough water, too much water, temperature extremes, but then also kind of the indirect effects that weather and climate have on things like insect pests, disease, competitor species and weeds. And then you have, of course, the kind of outside effects here of markets, which is, usually being the weather and climate person, I'm the one who delivers the bad news. But this year I've been able to be good news, and then the market folks can deliver the bad news. But we also have, the variability of markets, of course, input prices, regulation, and policy that are acting on this entire ethos. For farming, we're dealing with all of these interactions that directly affect the crop and production, but then also affect the profitability and the sustainability of the farm. So that's all to say it's really, really complicated. So we really want to take what kind of this long-term view to say what are the things that we're seeing that we've seen in the last few years moving forward that we may see either differently or at a higher frequency or lower frequency that we really want to get ahead of, and how do we plan while also being profitable and sustainable year after year, but also planning for the 10-year, 20-year timeline. So that's what I'm hoping to do here. All right. And I'm not going to talk about markets, input prices, or regulation. Let's just focus on weather because that's what I can actually talk about. All right. So the first thing I want to mention is heavy rain, and I have this is the problem with pulling a video from YouTube is you all are going to get an advertisement. But then we can actually get to the main event here. This is flooding in the Nashville area in Washington County. The dam spillway was opened up, and just to be clear, the dam is functioning the way it's supposed to. There was no actual failure, but this was caused by significant rainfall. You can see in the bottom left corner there, where we had storms that were training over that southwest part of Illinois for several hours. Storms really started, and you can see the flash flood warnings start to pop up. But storms started very early in the morning of July 16th, and they continued till about 2 to 3 p.m. Parts of St. Clair and Washington counties picked up something like, in some cases, up to 10 inches of rain in less than 24 hours. This is just one extreme example of what we've been seeing across the state with heavier overall rain. Now, the state of Illinois is getting wetter overall. That's part of our long-term climate trend. But I think more impactful, especially for agriculture, but also for other types of issues, is heavier rain. So we're getting more rain, but it's falling over shorter periods of time. And of course, that does a number of things, including overwhelming stormwater drainage systems or tiling systems in ag fields. And you get issues like what we saw just a few weeks ago. As a case in point here, the Metro East area has been accustomed to this over the last few years. But just to give you an example of what this looks like kind of statistically, 2022 was the sixth wettest summer, June through August in St. Louis. And for the Metro East, it was about the same as well. But about 2/3 of that sixth wettest summer rainfall came in just 2 days. And in fact, most of that came in about 12 hours from very heavy rainfall events. So when you look back on the effects of a cropping system, of rainfall in that cropping system, having the sixth wettest summer on record may be just kind of face value beneficial. But when we get dryness, 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 and then a huge amount of rain, and then dryness again, the crop is reacting much differently to that kind of rain pattern than it would be if we got prolonged kind of a nice gentle rains that seem to be in short supply anymore in the summertime. As an example, this is the same kind of time series for summer 2022, and this is in Madison County, but this is showing it as a drought index. And so if you think about the drought monitor, we have these different categories of the drought monitor going from moderate to severe drought. And based on this drought index, starting in the beginning of June in Madison County of 2022, we saw consistently dry conditions that culminated in what could have been something considered extreme drought. And we saw this is I guess a bean field across in, I think this was Madison County as well at that time. Pretty significant issues there from just a lack of water. And then that area gets 12 inches of rain in a day, and we have flooding in Belleville and Edwardsville, and then it dries out again, and we dip back down into that drought. Now, again, when we add this up, this region had a top 10 wettest summer on record, but when it comes in this kind of pattern, it's much less beneficial than we would think a wet summer would be. So this is kind of the framework of what I'm presenting here is we think about a climate trend, right? And this is really important to understand that the heavier rain that we've seen over the last few years is something that models are projecting will likely continue, if not increase into the future. So when we think about that 10 to 20 year plan, we need to be planning for those heavier rainfall events while also at the same time managing those heavy rainfall events and kind of the year-to-year variability that we get. The climate trend here is towards heavier rainfall, and of course that produces more runoff, potential for soil erosion, and less root zone soil moisture. So when that water carries with it its nutrients, carries with it its soil down into our waterways, it's not staying in the root zone where we may need it. And if you get a situation like what we had in 2022 in the St. Louis area, where you get really big flush of water and then that water all runs off into the Mississippi, it's not there in your soil for prolonged dry periods afterward. And so managing that water, and I think Frank said it really well before and earlier, is that just keeping the water in the soil, keeping it where it belongs once it hits the ground is really important. So the ag and economic impacts that come from this climate trend, which again is likely going to continue into the future, less effective inputs, right? Input cost is a major problem, and having a significant chunk of your nitrogen or other types of inputs leaving that soil and leaving that field is really ineffective. We have soil production loss through erosion, as well as just tighter windows overall, whether it be tighter spring planting windows in the fall for harvest, herbicide, pesticide, fungicide applications during the growing season. All of those things tend to be tighter because we have these big bursts of rainfall that can create standing water issues that may make it hard to get into the fields. And then the economic impact is if the inputs are gone, you're either getting less return on that input cost or you're having to apply more. Which can be an environmental problem, but also you just have more input costs overall. Also losing that top end yield. What's interesting is that when we look at, just take corn, for example, corn yields over the last 30 or 40 years in Illinois statewide, we see, 2012 and 1988, those stick out like sore thumbs. When we get a big drought year, we see the decline. That's just the way it goes. But if we take those 2 years out, the largest deviations, negative deviations from the trend line are extremely wet years like 2019. And so, we do see it's not the catastrophic yield loss that we see in drought years, but we do see the loss of that top end yield in our crops when we get those really wet conditions. And then, of course, as we're losing soils, we're losing those nutrients from the disrupting the soil microbe activity. We have less long-term sustainability in our systems. So the economic solution here for dealing with this long-term trend of heavier rainfall are these long-term conservation practices and water management strategies. A lot of people are putting in tiling. Tiling is sort of a band-aid for this. It does work, channeling water out of that root zone when we get too much of that rain, especially in our wet springs. But it's more of a year-to-year management strategy versus a long-term strategy. We really want to be looking at those long-term conservation practices, like, for example, herbaceous or riparian buffers, to reduce the amount of nutrients that are leaving the fields and getting into our waterways. And so when we think about something like heavier rainfall, again, we want to manage that year to year, of course, and the variability that comes with that, but we need to also be thinking on that 10 to 20 year lifetime to say these heavier rains are likely going to become more frequent. How can we manage this so we can stay profitable over the next 10 years, as opposed to just dealing with the headache year to year? And those long-term conservation practices that I'm sure Dallas will talk about are a key way of doing that. Another trend is hotter and more humid summers. So the plot on the right-hand side here, these are climate model projections of very warm nights. So it's days when we get a nighttime temperature doesn't get below 70 degrees. And you can see the projections, this red and green area, indicating an increase, a likely increase over the next several decades of those very warm nights across the state. And in some cases up to an additional month worth of 70-degree nights, 70+ degree nights just across central Illinois alone. And those increasing minimum temperatures or nighttime temperatures are representative of higher humidity levels. And when we get those high humidity levels, we have all sorts of issues, including in our specialty crops, issues like flower abortion, issues of disease pressure, of course, which is something that, I mean, we're dealing with fungal disease, it seems like year after year. Even in a relatively dry start to the growing season like what we had last year, we still had some fungal disease pressure. And then, of course, with farming being a laborious activity, having heat stress, major issue in our both our crop and our livestock systems is dealing with increased exposure to heat stress. So this is a human health problem just as much as it a crop problem as well. Also, because of those higher temperatures, we're seeing higher evaporation. So more demand of water from the air for our crops. So what I'm showing you here is over the last 40 years or so, the blue line is showing a change in summer, really growing season precipitation in McLean County. So there's a trend. McLean County precipitation during the growing season is increasing by about a half an inch per decade. So maybe 2 inches overall over the last 40 years, which is significant. But at the same time, our total evaporation over that same time period is increased by the same amount. So if we're getting more rain, but we're also seeing the same amount of rain leaving the ground through evaporation, then we're not necessarily netting the overall benefit of that increase in precipitation. And just like heavier rainfall, the hotter and more humid summers is a trend that the models, as I mentioned with the projection, the models kind of key into is something that is likely going to continue in the future. So, we can have years like what we had this year where July was a good degree and a half below normal as far as its temperature was concerned across the state of Illinois. And that's great. And we can take advantage of that. But in the next 10 to 20 years, there are very likely going to be more warmer years than there are cooler years. And so again, we have to manage year to year for profitability, but also have to plan on that 10-year timeline to make sure that if we're seeing more and more of these warm years, especially in the heart of the growing season, that we're able to sustain productivity and overall sustainability in that kind of warmer future. So same kind of framework here. The climate trend here is hotter and more humid summers. That's what we're looking at. It's what we've seen and what we're looking at continuing. The seemingly increased disease pressure that comes with these higher humidity values, that's something that's likely not going to go away in the next decade or so. The impacts of that we talked about, more disease and pest pressure, more crop, livestock, and worker heat stress. Those are big issues. The economic impacts of that are, of course, again, more input costs to try to deal with that to deal with those maybe stress issues and also the increased disease pressure. Lost top end yield. Again, we don't necessarily see huge yield losses from just heat alone. Oftentimes that heat is coupled with drought, and that's where we see the yield losses. But again, it's that top end yield that we may be missing out on because of that extreme heat or those high nighttime temperatures. Lower animal production. I mean, this is something we're seeing in our dairy for sure, is that when those animals are stressed because of high humidity values, we see that lower production. And of course, labor issues, whether it be finding labor or making sure that our labor force is protected from heat stress. So the economic solution here, it's a little bit less certain as far as the overall solutions for heat relative to heavy rainfall, but having diversified cropping and grazing systems to make sure that we can sort of diversify the risk that we have. So just like like a stock and bond portfolio where we don't want to have everything invested into one area. We want to make sure we're diversified in those investments. So that can be really, really helpful if we do see an impact from extreme heat, we see fungal disease pressure, for example, for one crop, that not all the eggs are in that basket, so to speak. And then, of course, cooling infrastructure. This can be the kind of evaporative cooling infrastructure for confined operations, or things like silvopasture, grazing among trees to provide that cooling benefit of for livestock operations. So again, when we think about diversified cropping, cooling infrastructure, these are longer term investments that can be hard to kind of square with the kind of year-to-year focus of profitability. But at the same time, when we look at those trends of higher overall temperatures, higher overall heavier rainfall, we need to understand that if we're just looking year to year, we're going to start deviating from those climate trends and getting less and less return on the overall investment. So while at the same time we have to focus on that year to year, we also need to think about those 10-year kind of timelines to think about how we can be even more productive, profitable, sustainable with these climate trends over the next 10 years or so. Okay, last thing I want to talk about was wind. Of course, we all know where this was at. In 2023, we had that major dust storm. We actually had a couple of dust storms this year as well. And of course, this was just a catastrophic event that really came out of nowhere. The last two examples of weather risks that I mentioned, these are things that are very tightly tied to long-term climate trends and climate change. So I can say with a good level of confidence that heavier rainfall, hotter, more humid summers is something that we've seen. It's something we can tie to kind of overall changes in global patterns, and it's something that we'll likely see into the future. As far as wind is concerned, it's not, we aren't necessarily seeing those long-term trends. So we want to be careful to, I use this from this reporter you can see here. Just even hours after that windstorm, how intense that wind was. And this was a extreme weather event that is likely going to happen again at some point, but is not linked with long-term climate change. So I cannot sit here and tell you that we don't have evidence that what happened on May 1st, 2023 is something that we're likely going to see more of into the future. That's just not the case. The same way parts of the state have dealt with derechos in each of the last 2 years that have created some kinds of damage, right? Nothing like what we saw in 2020 in Iowa, but damage nonetheless. So when I talk about the last two examples of heavier rainfall and higher temperatures, those are climate trends. Those are something we're going to see into the future at a higher frequency, and we got to deal with. With wind, it's more of a weather hazard. It's something that happens. It's going to continue happening, but we're not necessarily having to deal with more and more higher frequency of wind. So strong straight line winds is the weather hazard. There's no consistent trend, but just as much as I don't have evidence to tell you that these things are getting more frequent, I don't have evidence telling me they're getting less frequent either. So it's something we're still going to have to deal with in the repertoire of all of the weather hazards that can, impact agriculture. The ag impacts of wind, of course, we have crop damage, green snap, goosenecking, things like that, major soil erosion, which of course is part of the dust storm, and then herbicide pesticide drift, major problem as well. Economic impacts of that, lower crop yields. Obviously, if you have major green snap, especially below the ear, it's going to be a problem with crop yields. Higher input costs, just as always, especially keeping up that soil health in a system that can be conducive to large-scale soil erosion, and less long-term sustainability. That's a big issue as well. Also, just like nutrients leaching fields through runoff, herbicide pesticide drift getting onto places we don't want it means that it's not getting on the place we want it. So again, those input costs are really important too. It's just not a really sustainable way of practicing. So the solutions to this.
Looks like we temporarily lost Trent. Oh, he's back.
Oh no, am I back?
Yep, you're back.
Where'd you leave? Where'd I leave you?
It was really sudden.
Yeah.
Really sudden.
You're talking about solutions, Trent. You just
Oh,
Yeah.
oh,
before you
good.
cut out.
Okay. Am I sharing or do I need to reshare?
You'll have to
I bet.
reshare. Yeah.
That was weird. Sorry about that, everyone. Usually I'm hard connected to the university's internet. You can see me there? We good?
Yep, you're perfect.
All
Yep.
right, all right. Well, there are solutions. I didn't just want to cut out at the problem. Usually I do that, but I'm actually going to provide solutions here. Forest and herbaceous windbreaks can be really beneficial, of course, in reducing the potential for wind damage, but also the potential for disease drift. So when we see fungal disease, bacterial disease drift across fields, having those forest and herbaceous windbreaks can also make a difference in at least reducing the transmission rates of those diseases. But also when we think about keeping soil in the ground or on the ground, not having that wind-based erosion, having cover crops, conservation tillage, these are in the infield practices that can really be helpful when we do see those really high intense wind events in the spring and the fall. Okay, so last couple of slides here, and this is really transitioning to Dallas, and you know, a lot of times I'll be talking about these issues and have to cover this of like, oh, what do we do and what are examples? And I have Dallas now, so I can just push it to him to say, here's all the problems. Now he's going to tell you all the solutions. But I did want to just kind of transition that to say kind of the pathway to climate and weather resilience. Again, just thinking about that 10-year timeline, for example, is identifying goal and objectives. The goal is obviously production, but also conservation, biodiversity, soil health, climate. Sometimes we think of those things as contrasting, but they can go hand in hand. Developing a production and conservation plan. What strategies, practices, timelines, and evaluation do you want to see for your operations? Because that can differ depending on your operation, where you're at. But also then identifying opportunities for technical and financial assistance because it's there. And under the guise of climate smart agriculture, it's increasingly there. So there are these opportunities to enact some of these longer term solutions to be resilient in the face of changing winds, rain, and temperature patterns. And of course, there's all these resources and examples. So it's not just starting from scratch. There are, you know, dozens and dozens of examples of these kinds of what ISAP calls the conservation story map, which is really insightful to hear about how peers are doing these things to make kind of this long-term change for more sustainable practices. So with that, I think I did go over my time, so my apologies, and I'll just turn it back over to Frank here.
Nope, that was perfect, Trent. Thanks again. Yeah, like I said, we've got a handful of questions in the chat already. So yeah, please do keep sending those in and we'll get to those at the end. But for now, we're going to move right into Dallas's presentation. So while I'm introducing him, he can go ahead and get his slides pulled up here. So a lot of you know Dallas. Dallas grew up farming grain and cattle on a fifth-generation family farm in East Central Illinois. He received a degree in restoration ecology from the University of Illinois. And from there, he has worked in multiple aspects of conservation, finally landing his role with Pheasants and Quail Forever in 2018. His work in precision agriculture and conservation has allowed him to incorporate profitable habitat on his own farm, as well as many other farms across the state of Illinois. When you're ready, the floor is yours, Dallas.
Sounds good. Frank, you can see my screen, right? Got it shared, right?
Yep, looks good.
All right. Sounds good. Yeah. Yeah, glad to be talking to everybody. Yeah, as Frank mentioned, fifth generation farmer up in Paxton, Illinois. So just north of Champaign, went to U of I. Love hearing all the research. I could sit there and just listen to Trent's and all the facts come out, and it plays well into this because I go over to a little more on the ground solutions to what farmers can actually implement and really put that conservation into profitability. Advance here. So I got 3 examples going to be going over, 2 of which are in Ford County and 1 is in Champaign County. Here's a farm that is a 160-acre farm that came into the office. They were initially wanting to redo some tile. They had an eroding stream bank as well as wet and hard to farm locations and some tile breaks and stuff like that. And so instead of bumping into and filling out the paperwork for redoing tile with the USDA office, he found me instead, and we went down a different plan. So he ended up being within a priority area for both the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, USDA, a lot of state programs, which really cover most of the state now. There's quite a bit of programs available and out there. ISAP has plenty of people on there that you can reach on that tool and find out the proper programs for you on their find program or tool. So definitely check out that and see what's in your area. But what I do is I look at the yield monitor that comes out of the combine. So this here is a 4-year average yield map of that particular farm. So we took 4 years. This is combined corn and soy. Here's a corn soybean rotation. And we mesh it up. And so red, of course, is your low yielding Green, of course, is your high yielding for the average. We compare that to his expenses because the yield map doesn't really mean too much other than pretty colors unless you're doing something with that data. And then came up with this map instead. So instead of just looking at, this place or this particular acre made 200 bushel corn, that particular acre made 150 bushel corn, we said, all right, what is the profit loss of this farm? So where are you actually making money? Where are you losing money? Now we have red acres that are costing the farmer. Again, this is a 4-year average, so this is not just a snapshot, single weather event type of scenario. This is a trend that we are looking at. So these red areas are where this farmer is losing money. Green is where he is profiting, and that can be adjusted based off the profit that a particular farmer is wanting. So this particular map is just if he's a penny more in profit, it shows up green. And so, but it can be adjusted in particular for that farmer's needs. And so then we started looking at the site potential because he is in a unique area of Ford County where I read a report in the 1800s that settlers were actually portaging through. They were going up the Middle Fork Vermilion River, portaging through this area, and then canoeing down the Vermilion, and would actually make a complete loop from the Wabash, the Illinois, to the Mississippi and back up. So he was in a high wetland potential area, and that's why there was the U.S. Fish and Wildlife interest for this site. So you can see the areas. This is all acres. The numbers on there are acres that can be flooded with a small berm up to 18 inches. So there's plenty of areas that he is looking at some water. Of course, some of those acres were profitable. So we ended up looking at just the negative acres and found out this map instead. So on this 160, we are looking at 27 acres into a wetland program, and then as well as 9 acres into a pollinator program that were on the hill slopes. But you can see those little blue points. Those are the wetlands that got established and are currently there. But just by taking those acres out, so just looking at those acres, he's still at 99 acres of this farm. He actually saves $5,940 per year by taking out these risky acres, these acres that are not profitable. And as well, he is getting a payment, CRP payment, of $5,119 per year. So he'd be money ahead if he just stopped farming these acres. But because of the programs and the resources available out there, he's able to actually put it into a program and receive an additional $5,000. So on this 160 acre farm, he is now profiting $11,059 more per year. And my area, Central Illinois, tile takes about 3 to 5 years to break even off that cost of investment. So by doing this, instead of redoing that tile, he's actually going to be profiting between $33,000 and $55,000. And I don't know, some of the farmers sitting on here, to me, that's a good payment. I could pay down a good piece of my equipment if I was able to put that back in my pocket. As well, we ran his Russell factors, and that measures his amount of soil erosion and looking at his total inputs. And Trent hit it perfect where these weather events are, you're going to be impacting your inputs. And so he was able to reduce his inputs by 10%, 35% on the total farm, saving 81 tons of soil lost via water erosion. And as well, the wetlands are filtering out a lot of the nutrients that are applied that goes through, and he's building wildlife habitat, and the family is able to enjoy this farm again. Just going to brief a little bit about the construction to showcase that it is not, a lot of these wetlands, people think that you're coming in with big equipment, and they're really not. This is looking at it during the year. You can see the berms there. It's just small little scrapes, and they got tile risers, so these wetlands can actually be completely drained. So that allows for management, and as well as that way it doesn't come overly involved with an invasive species or stuff like that. Just the seed mix there. This is summer 21, so that emergent vegetation actually sprung up without being seeded. The water depth is no greater than 18 inches, and it's actually, we're seeing results of the cornfields up against these, that the water in the summer months is still being retained in that soil. So the crop is benefiting from these wetlands because the water's not just washing out and now it's gone into the Mississippi. It's being retained on this farm. And there's a wildlife, found it really quick. And then the landowner, so he's a 50-50 with his relatives. He hadn't hunted this property in over 30 years due to lack of pheasants. And in 2022, we went and hunted. We saw 5 roosters and harvested 2 of them. So it's always nice to get out and recreate. That's one thing I stress a lot, is farming's fun, but hunting's a lot more fun. And being able to actually go out and enjoy your property will make you appreciate it more. Switching gears a little bit, going into Champaign County. This is something that probably a lot more farmers will be familiar with, is with their crop insurance and APH. So this is again, an 80-acre farm in Champaign County. Came in, wanted to have his data ran. Just having corner patches and some problem spots, just like every other farmer. And this is NDVI imagery. We had his actual data as well, but also pulled up NDVI measures plant photosynthesis. So looking at the plant stress problems, or also those low yielding problems. And so we're looking at those. And we came up with this. So his average on this 83-acre farm, for corn, he was bringing in 231 bushel corn, profiting $387 an acre. He's in prime good black flat dirt, but there's still problems in those areas that are, good flat and black and beautiful crop ground. And doing conservation practices can improve it, because just by looking at 7 acres going into CRP, that pays $234 an acre, his total farm profit, because he is not spending the amount of money to invest into this low yielding 7.85 acres, his profit actually jumps up to $830 an acre across the entire 80. So he's over doubling his profit just by knocking off the bottom yielding. And he's also a cover cropper. So it's not just with edge of field practices, it is infield practices. And he is doing rye ahead of his soybeans. And we brought up the idea of his end rows. End rows are historically not profiting acres. And so what he's doing instead is, we looked at those end rows, and instead of planting them into beans, he's going to come by and harvest off that rye, and that rye will actually give him enough seed to cut down his cover crop on 3 more 80-acre farms of his that he has. So also increased, and you can see his average yield is increasing. That's important when it comes into the APH conversation on my next slide, is because you're removing your bottom, your average yield is increasing. And that's exactly what gets placed into cropping history and the APH when it comes to crop insurance, is they take your APH, multiply it by spring price or fall price, and then by the coverage level. So the farmer gets to dictate the coverage level and what they're producing. So they don't get to dictate the price and stuff like that, but they can play on those ends to increase it. So by increasing his average yield throughout the time, this is a long-term plan. So it takes 10 years, but good thing CRP plans also take 10 years. So you can start seeing that result and getting in. But without habitat on that farm, he's looking at 231. That particular year was 459 spring price. If he did an 85% coverage level, he's looking at a 903 guarantee per acre. But if you were doing that habitat, so same price, same scenario with that bushel increase by doing habitat, he's looking at an additional $30 per acre more by doing so. So if he were to make a claim because of a random event came through, if a wind event came through or that 10-inch rain came through, he's now going to be getting paid more by removing that risk. Another example of this is one that's going across the state really hard. Prairie strips. Illinois actually leads the entire nation in prairie strip adoption. And the best way I can kind of describe it is think of kind of like a terrace, but instead of berming anything, you're actually just planting deep-rooted native perennials, and they bloom, and you're still tilling in your field, you're still spraying in your field. They're just 15 to 30 foot wide strips going through your farm, and they are really impactful. This is a farm just on the Ford Champaign County line, just outside of Gibson City. Again, you're in that good prime flat black dirt, but there's a lot of benefits that can be made there. Some of the goals, this particular farmer listened to Dr. Jonathan Lundgren, who I know talked to the last presentation here in this series, and his main goals were to look at the pest pressure and decrease his need of insecticides and pesticides on this farm. And so out of a standard cornfield, you're looking at 7% of the insects there that are potential pests and problem insects to a crop. That leaves 137 to 161,000 beneficial insects per acre. So 93% of the insects found at a standard cornfield are beneficial or non-harming insects, and so they are helping you. This here is the layout. So this is a 50-acre field. We went with 15-foot wide strips every 120 acres and 120 feet. So we're looking at 5% of the field. And that 120 feet was, for one, it fit his planting equipment, but as well, he was able to go through and drive along these strips, because these are non-CRP, hanging 60 foot either direction, and do foliar applications to increase his yield while going through it. But with the use of cover crops and these strips, he has actually now cut out the use of all insecticides and herbicides because he has not seen the need for it. So he is at $9,000 a year saved. And as well as Iowa State University published a study that 10% reduction of farm into strips can actually reduce soil loss by 95%, nitrates by 72%, total N by 70%. And we have some pictures here outlining that. So this was June of 2019. You just end up with a beautiful flowers in a field. So it's nothing, no engineering, just seeding down a little bit, and you run it with your GPS, so your tractor doesn't even know that they're there and thinks nothing of it. But in June of 2020, we received a 6-inch rain event, and as Trent was saying, that seems to be the common thing. So we are getting wetter, and it's coming down more heavier rainfall events than not. So at each strip, he actually had 8 inches increase in soil. So there's a 420 acre drainage area that comes into this 50. And so the 6-inch rain event, large flooding across the area. He did have water, as you can see with this picture here, the corn stalks that were built up. But the thing is, he currently has corn planted those. So those were not his corn stalks. They were the neighbor's corn stalks. And the neighbor actually had to come in and with a backhoe fill in a gully that came through that now Rick has. So he, has that soil. So I like to make the joke saying that he is the only farmer in Ford County that is actually gaining soil without having to buy it. 21 is whenever the natives actually really started popping up. So that's the benefit, as well as the first year with that rain event. We had some natives, but they were not in full bloom. They were still establishing and impacting that strong even in their infancy. And so now they're in full bloom, and you're seeing a lot of more benefits popping through. And you end up with beautiful flower strips within your field that he is actually managing with grazing. So he's diversifying his operation and running pasture pork along these strips to allow himself a different revenue stream, manage these strips and field. And then the biggest part is he'll actually rotate these into the field as well. So these pigs are taking the nutrients that the strips contain and are spreading it out into the field. So he's seeing big benefits on his nitrogen usage, phosphorus usage, and potassium within his crop field, because these pigs are taking it from the strip and bringing it back out. And that is my quick presentation. But yeah, there's plenty of things out there for farmers that can help manage and conserve these weather events and still do it profitably.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dallas. We appreciate that.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got a ton of questions, which is good because we've got plenty of time. I've tried to group some of these just to be a little bit more efficient. So we'll try to get to them all. So just to give Dallas a second to take a break, we'll shoot some questions for Trent here. So we had some questions about wind events. And so it said, though we can't predict wind events, do you know what the practice would be, the most successful practices to prevent wind erosion of fields? Any insight on that?
Yeah, so to prevent wind erosion, the two kind of general categories of practices that are most effective are kind of edge of field practices that provide borders, so herbaceous or forest boundaries, like I mentioned before, hedgerows, those kind of things. And they have the kind of co-benefit of also helping with biodiversity, as well as nutrient runoff reduction and things like that, especially if they're along waterways. So that's one thing. And of course, those are just edge of field practices. So any kind of competition for nutrients or moisture that trees or shrubs would have would just be right along the edge of those fields. The other kind of category of practices would be in-field practices, things like cover cropping, and especially during the off season. Now, the time of the year in Illinois that we are most likely to get strong wind events, to say nothing of what's going on in the field, but the time of the year is between March and April, and again between September and late October. So those are especially the spring time periods when we don't have an actively growing crop in most fields, and so having that cover can at least provide, even if it's one of the kind of cover crops that burn down early and it's just biomass, even if it's dead in the field, to have that biomass in the field can really hang on to that soil and reduce that erosion. So those kind of infield practices, but also the kind of boundaries are two ways of reducing that kind of soil erosion. Yeah.
Awesome. We do have another wind question here, again from Corey Lacey. So in addition to those practices to help mitigate risk, is there any resources where farmers can identify if their fields are in a location where wind erosion is more or less of a risk? So I know Helen linked to a possible map that maps wind intensity. Are there certain specific corridors? Should farmers be worried about a certain soil type or texture? Or geography? Like what should they be worried about there?
Yeah, so the map that Helen mentioned was just based off wind. And yes, in general, so there isn't a great product that I've found that is a good tool to predict or show differences in the risk of wind erosion. We have some of those for water erosion, and I can link to that here when I'm done. Especially the archaeological survey has done a lot of this work, because archaeological digs are at risk for erosion as well. For wind, though, what we've seen, and I don't know about the soil type issue, that's something I think a soil scientist is going to have to weigh in on. What we've seen is that by stringing together reports of the most significant dust storms in the history, the kind of recorded history in Illinois, going back to the 1800s, what we see is that timing that I mentioned before, the spring and the fall, but also that the majority of these events have happened in kind of the central, west central part of Illinois, roughly between Galesburg, St. Louis, and Champaign, that kind of triangle. That's where we have the flattest land, and oftentimes also the least amount of obstruction. So we get strong winds all across the state, but when we have those flat stretches of land with very few obstructions, that's when we have the highest potential from like a wind standpoint of getting that erosion. Now, based on the soil characteristics, that's something I think I'd have to leave to somebody else to talk about.
Awesome. Thank you. One more I'll try to combine here for you, Trent, before we take a break and go to Dallas. Let's see, how do I sum this one up? So we do have some questions on volatility, but I think specifically first I'll kind of touch on nighttime temperatures. And so nighttime temperatures are really important. I remember at the U of I, there was a study going on while I was there where they really narrowed down that one of the biggest impacts to corn yield potential was actually nighttime temperatures. That's when the corn takes a break, kind of breathes a little bit. And so sustained high temperatures at night certainly can knock down corn yield pretty substantially. So what, Trent, do we know the causes of that increase in nighttime temperatures? They've listed some options here, like soil being covered with infrastructure, like road surfacing, parking lots, buildings, and then specifically mentioned things like solar panels. Do we know what's causing those nighttime increases?
Yeah, so the nighttime increases that we've seen are all across the state. They're statewide, and if we think about the state of Illinois, it's pretty diverse in its cover. Well, I mean, when we think about from the more developed parts of the state to more rural parts of the state, the cover, the land cover there is pretty different. So, to the point of the development, the impervious surfaces that come with development over soil, there is an effect there, but it's pretty localized. So that's part of the urban heat island effect that we see not just across Chicago, but in some of our smaller cities as well. That does play a role, and what that does is it elevates those nighttime temperatures even more than the surrounding rural areas. But our stations that we have, long-term climate stations in our rural areas, including the one right behind my office just south of Champaign here, show the same kind of trends that we do in our urban areas as well. So we know that there is a role of land cover, but it's not the dominant driver. The dominant driver of these long-term, in some cases century scale changes in nighttime temperatures is a response to both higher humidity and more overall warming on a regional level that's linked with climate change. And in fact, that response, when we take it in the models and look at the response of nighttime temperatures to continued warming globally over the next several decades, we see the strongest response in nighttime temperatures, strongest and most consistent. So that gives us more confidence that this is that at least a large chunk of the warming we've seen overnight is linked with long-term change that we're likely going to continue to see at least over the next few decades. Yeah.
Is there any just broader tie there to volatility? We had a couple of questions on land use and cover. They're talking about bare fields here. Any impact on volatility there? Is it kind of the same answer? And then we had, I think, a somewhat related question just with land use and volatility that as a farmer, I'm going to be crushed if you disprove this. But the idea of when a storm is coming and it always splits on Gifford, Illinois, or it always splits on Peoria. Any truth to that, or how does that work?
Gosh, I don't want to alienate an audience here, but so everybody, if you talk to everyone across the state, especially those who pay attention to the weather, whose livelihood depends on the weather, everybody believes that there is some sort of consistent split in the weather where they just get missed by the rainfall. And indeed, that does happen in certain years where we just get an sort of random where the rain pops up, especially during the summertime, because it's so sort of random of where we get the isolated showers where we don't. And there isn't any kind of evidence of areas of the state being in some sort of rain shadow. A lot of the times it's this perception, and this is why drought is one of the most impactful kind of hazards, because it has an emotional and mental health impact too. When we're in drought, when we're depending on that rain, people tend to focus on the times they get missed, but when they do get that rain, it's tend to be focused on other problems. And that's what happened this year, right? We were very wet across July. What happens? We start hearing about issues with aphids and disease, right? People aren't focusing on the weather because the weather's been good overall. So that I don't want to blow up, or wreck your thoughts there, but that's sort of the perception. But we don't see any evidence of any kind of consistent rain shadow or things like that. As far as the volatility is concerned, I think there's a big question of how climate change interacts with kind of year-to-year weather variability and volatility that I think remains unanswered. That being said, there's nothing telling us that our weather is going to be less volatile into the future. We're still going to get some pretty variable weather. It's the kind of climate that we live in, so that should be expected as well.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, I know we're really getting into the weeds on some of the local variability. Everybody's trying to explain why they see the patterns they see. Shifting over to Dallas here, and some of these you may have mentioned and answered in chat, but we may ask you just for the group, just in case people can't see that with where they're at. So Corey had a question. So how do adding wetlands and hunting areas impact farmland values?
Yeah, I was actually just reading that one, and I mean farmland values are going to be there. The thing is with these farms, since they're targeting the acres that are unprofitable for those wetlands, it is increasing the farm's profitability on there. So this farmer is not selling his farm. So as far as the appraised value, I do not know how that has impacted, but I do know he's able to enjoy it more. That particular area has more wetlands in, and they have actually seen an increase in price per acre because that's targeting the low profiting. So the corn and the soybeans that are being farmed are making more money. And then with the wetlands, of people able to actually enjoy the ground, they have a little more drive and interest to purchase it. So that particular area around that Chatsworth, Livingston County, to Piper City is where that is at, has actually seen an increase in land value.
Awesome. I wonder if you could speak to, have you seen anyone that you've worked with? Yes, they're doing it maybe for personal hunting reasons or friends and family. Anybody able to utilize any of these areas as an additional revenue stream in any way? Anybody doing that?
Yep, I know of one person who opened up their farm for it's called IRAP, the Illinois Recreational Access Program. So it opens up farms for public hunting. They then receive access to DNR strike teams that come out and help assist with the management. So you're saving on the management side of things. And for like upland hunting, they pay $7 an acre. So you're not going to get rich by doing that, but if you are removing a lot of your costs of management for these sites, you're gaining $7, and it's open enough for public hunting. In the collar counties, I do know people that will lease out their land, in particular for goose hunting. And some of those farmers outside of the Chicago area, where there is more people in competition for goose permits, are making about $10,000 a year per goose pit that they allow sitting there. So there is definitely some money that can be brought into the farm with the use of hunting here in the state of Illinois.
Awesome. We did have a few tile questions, which you maybe hit in chat. So
I love tile questions.
Oh, good. We got a couple.
Yeah.
So I think one is more, we do hear a lot of criticism of tile as a conservation, just its impacts on conservation. While it does have some pretty great benefits to crop yields, conservation wise, I think there's some data that maybe doesn't make it look as good sometimes. So what can farmers do in a tile drain system to make sure that it's checking those conservation boxes?
Yeah, like one of the questions that I saw in there was the thought about roots breaking off, plugging tile, etc. Roots don't break off if they're still living. perennial vegetation that's brought in are living root systems, and those root systems stay intact. So a lot of those plug issues that deal with cover crops, I've only seen those right after a farmer kills his cover crop and then a mass rain event comes in, and all those roots that are in the tile system are breaking off and being plugged. So as long as you, well, for one, can't control the weather, and as Trent's saying, we are getting more extreme weather events. So time your cover crop terminations and take that into consideration, and as well as keep those roots alive. And the good thing with perennial vegetation, those roots stay alive. So that's one with the plugging. And then one that I thoroughly enjoy when it deals with wetlands, and I was touching up on it beforehand, is tiles work both ways. So that water can either go out or it can go back. So a lot of these are being utilized since there's a water control structure that farmer and landowner can actually adjust the level that wetland holds, and can back water from the wetland back into the field in the tile system. So that particular farmer that I gave the example, he's actually controlling his wetland to keep moisture in his farm throughout the growing season. So that corn crop is now retaining that water and moisture because he's putting that water back onto the field versus just sending it straight to the ditch.
Yeah, for sure. And holding on that water can certainly be a way to clean it up a little bit as well if you've got a growing crop.
Correct. Yeah.
It.
Yeah. You probably know what wetlands, they remove like 90% of nutrients, or it's a really high number that you get to keep if you have that system and structure.
Sure. I think just maybe one more tile question here. Any concerns with just general tile blockages, even from living roots in those prairie strips? And I would just add one thing. I think actually our last risk management conference hit on tile concerns in cover crop systems. So that may be something for folks to check out. But typically in the area when we've seen tile blockages in any kind of a system, either there's some speculation that there's maybe a house tied to that tile system somewhere down the line, or if you go down the line on a tile system, you may find a heavily tilled field that has a tile inlet where it's letting in a lot of dirt. So those are kind of locally where we see those issues. Any insight, Dallas, into when you any concerns there for in a prairie strip?
Yeah, within the prairie strips that farmer does have tiles running through, he's actually seen an increase in the efficiencies of his tile there. So the strips slow down the water, spread it out, and allow them to get absorbed into the tile and move through. He has not seen any blockages or had any problems with it. So is that going to be a standard across the realm? No, because tile are they're so interconnected nowadays. Like you mentioned with houses and neighboring farmers, their management practices come into play. So that's definitely one to consider with your particular area.
Sure. We did have just a general comment here that sometimes it's hard to get farmers to understand that you can make more by farming less. And I just wanted to turn that maybe into a question for you, Dallas, on just in the work that you do, what is that common pushback? What is it that you say that makes the light bulb go on for people? Like what are those conversations, those farmer level conversations like for you?
Yeah, the hardest farmer I ever convinced that farming less can make more was actually my dad. That was by far the hardest person I've had to convince. I've had people that they give me their data straight from their combine. They give me their expenses. I plug it in, give them the map, and say, "Yep, these are where you're losing money." This particular farmer, he was across a 70-acre field. He was losing $80 an acre on average across the entirety. And he said that he was wrong. And I'm like, well, do you have any numbers that you didn't give me or you didn't show me? Because I only took the data that you gave me. So it is really, really hard for some people to understand that farming particular acres or a whole field is costing them money, but it's a reality. So it's just one that it takes seeing to really understand it. And that's why I like presenting it in a map form, because that seems to go over better. with a visual image than instead of a spreadsheet. Yeah, the people that don't believe it, once they see it, and then we do something and they have those conversions come around, they're like, oh yeah, that is possible. That is possible to make more with farming less because you're removing what's dragging you behind, cut off those chains.
No, I think it's a great service. And, just the financials that you showed are really incredible. You must charge so much for that service, Dallas. How much do you charge per acre?
It's free. It is
Wow.
free service. So we are like most of the people listed on the Find tool and the programs available. They are free for farmers to utilize. We are either grant funded, nonprofit funded, government funded, etc. So a lot of those programs you guys already paid for it, so you can come ask us questions anytime you want.
Awesome. Thank you. Just a few more questions here. And I may go ahead and actually bounce back to you, Trent. I know in our planning meeting for this session, you would kind of ask me what timeline I wanted to focus on for the meeting. And I said, like, I don't know, 5 to 10 years. And you said it'd be great if we could talk about more like 50 years. And then I begged and pleaded for 5 to 10. So, say you could talk about that 50-year timeline, for example. Like, what is there anything that you would change? Any additional detail you would give for that kind of, so people can think about kids and grandkids, like what things look like then?
No, I mean the biggest thing is the confidence in our climate trends. It sounds weird, but we can have more confidence in what climate change is going to bring to Illinois broadly at the 50-year time scale than we can at the 10-year time scale. Because if somebody were to ask me, how many times is my farm going to have a really heavy rainfall event over the next 10 years? It could be zero. Despite the increasing trend, could be zero. Actually, for most people, it will be zero. But for some, it won't be. For some, it may be 8 out of 10 years, and those are unfortunate. But when we think about the next 50 years, because I should back up, because the next 10 years, it's a lot of variability. And we could have a big drought year in the next 10 years. But when we think about kind of the long game here, it's really the next 50 years that we want to be thinking about more in the frequency and the likelihood of having these kind of events. And um, the likelihood that anybody's farm gets hit with a big rainfall event or that we get a huge drought that's really problematic in the next 50 years is not 100%, but it's not far from it because we know those things are. So we can think about the change in that way. That being said, yeah, I mean, we can talk about the next 50 years, but if it's going to kind of run counter to how everybody thinks and plans, then it's really all not all that helpful. So that's why I think the 10-year time scale is really good because we can kind of envision what 2034 kind of looks like. It's not just abstract, and it can be relevant for planning, but we can also get a little bit of information about things like heavy rainfall and heat, and that they're likely going to become more frequent, and that we're going to be dealing with those into the future. And so planning for those over the next 10 years can be a little bit more helpful than 50 years, for example.
Sure. Thank you. That makes sense. I think unless any more come back in chat here, I think we'll just end up with one more question for Dallas before we kind of close up here. We just had kind of a question on any thoughts you had on how to improve utilization of like a standard grass waterway, which is usually not the most diverse habitat in the world. So if we wanted to get more wildlife in those, I know for ours, it's just like a couple of species that we mow and that's about it. How can we use those better?
Yeah. So every farm's going to have those associated ag lands that are just sitting there. It's that buffer or that existing hedgerow, that waterway that runs through, and those can be touched upon. Usually they're sitting there and just brome or fescue and providing very little habitat benefit, and as well as little soil and water benefits as well. They usually get degraded, so they're water's cutting by them, so it's not even doing its job, or they get grown full of trees and they end up blocking things, and converting those and just giving those a little bit of attention can really bring some benefit in. So when it's looking at prairie strips and the benefits those provide, you can use the existing associated ag lands as those benefits. So that waterway can be sprayed down, converted over to warm season tall native grasses, as well as wildflowers. And USDA and NRCS, they have standards and protocols and cost share dollars to do so. And now you're bringing that benefit into your farm without having to take out other acres of production. You can now get those with that associated ag land. And there's plenty of grants and funding available to get those converted. Yeah, and I'm going to stress the FIND tool again because it even mentions all the different programs available within the state of Illinois based off of farmers' interests. I'm sure Helen will probably have a link of that somewhere into the chat. And so, yeah, easy research. A lot of personnel that are available to help guide to convert those over to improve your farm. Just takes asking the question.
Awesome. Thanks, Dallas. With that, I'll ask Rachel maybe to share her screen. We do have CEUs for this session. Perfect. And yeah, while people are pulling up their phones for that, just a huge thanks to our speakers for this session. I think we successfully tapped all the questions we could out of them, and we really do appreciate that. But if there are follow-up questions, please be sure to send those our way, and we can pass those along as time goes by. So again, there is the CEU credit link for those of you that don't have the app. At the bottom there is a link to email Rachel. And so, yeah, again, if you have follow-up questions, yeah, please do let us know. Or if you have trouble with that CEU code. And I think we have a poll here. Perfect. So yeah, if you would please answer that poll. Okay, we've still got answers rolling in from that. So while we're letting people answer that question, just wanted to again highlight that next week we will have our final session. We're going to hear from a representative from ADM and Pepsi, and they're going to not really just talk about what programs they're currently offering, as they do offer a lot of current programs for farmers, but we're more trying to understand from them, just how their respective companies are talking about where they see things in the future as far as supply chain, sustainable grain sourcing, that kind of thing. So really, where are these conversations at a deep company level is kind of what we're hoping to hear here. So with that, I think I'll go ahead and close the poll. Looks like we've got just about everybody on that. Perfect. Good. Some good results there. So learned a lot. I know I certainly did. So again, we do appreciate everybody being here and hope to see you next time. But if there are any questions, please let us know. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.